The animalistic scream, vocal analysis, and death classification. When we begin to examine what the neighbor reported hearing that night, a sound described as piercing, raw, and deeply unsettling, we're immediately faced with a question that sits at the intersection of human perception and forensic interpretation. This wasn't just any sound. It was characterized as something primal, something that cut through the silence of a winter night in a way that lingered in memory. So we have to ask ourselves, what does a scream tell us? What information is encoded in the very pitch, duration, and quality of a human voice pushed to its absolute limit? From a logical standpoint, we're looking at acoustic properties, frequency ranges, decibel levels, the physiological mechanics of vocal cord vibration under extreme duress. But from a psychological perspective, we're also considering what drives a person to produce such a sound, and perhaps more importantly, what it means that this sound was heard by someone outside the home, yet seemingly went unnoticed or unacknowledged by those inside. The contrast between these two realities creates a tension that demands exploration. Let's step back and think about the human voice as an instrument of communication, particularly in moments of crisis. Philosophically, the scream represents one of our most fundamental expressions, a sound that transcends language, culture, and conscious thought. It's the body's emergency broadcast system, an involuntary response that bypasses rational control. When we consider this from an anthropological lens, we see that across all human societies, the distress call of a child carries a unique signature that adults are evolutionarily wired to recognize and respond to. The acoustic properties differ measurably from adult vocalizations. Higher fundamental frequencies, different harmonic structures, a quality that triggers immediate attention. From a physiological standpoint, we're talking about the autonomic nervous system in full activation, the release of stress hormones flooding the bloodstream, the body's entire apparatus mobilizing in response to perceived threat. And here's where forensic criminology enters the picture. If we accept that this sound occurred, we must then ask what circumstances would produce it, what timeline it suggests, and critically, what it tells us about the awareness or lack thereof within that household during those crucial minutes. Theme 1. The acoustic signature of distress. We've examined countless witness statements over the years, but this particular account stands apart because of its specificity. The neighbor didn't describe a vague noise or an ambiguous sound that might have been anything. The description was visceral and immediate, a scream that sounded animalistic. That word choice matters enormously. When someone uses that term, they're conveying something that transcended normal human vocalization, something that struck them as coming from a place beyond rational thought or controlled expression. From a deductive reasoning perspective, we have to consider what would cause a witness to reach for that particular descriptor. It suggests a sound that was raw, unfiltered, and fundamentally disturbing in its quality. The logical inference is that this wasn't a shout, a call for help with articulated words, or even a typical cry of pain. This was something more primal, more desperate. And when we layer that understanding with what we know about the physiology of extreme fear or distress, we begin to see how the human vocal apparatus changes under conditions of overwhelming threat. Think about the mechanics for a moment. When the sympathetic nervous system activates, when that fight or flight response kicks in, the body undergoes profound changes. the heart rate accelerates dramatically, sometimes doubling or tripling its resting pace. Blood vessels constrict in the extremities while dilating in the core and major muscle groups. The respiratory rate increases, the airways dilate, and oxygen consumption spikes. All of these physiological changes affect vocalization. The vocal cords tense, the diaphragm contracts with greater force, and the resonating chambers of the throat and nasal passages shift their configuration. What emerges is a sound that carries differently, louder, higher-pitched, more penetrating. From an anthropological perspective, this makes evolutionary sense. A distress call needs to travel, to alert others who might be far enough away that normal speech wouldn't reach them. The scream is designed by millions of years of natural selection to be impossible to ignore, to trigger an immediate response in anyone within earshot. So, when we think about that winter night and that sound cutting through the darkness, we're thinking about a biological imperative being expressed at its most fundamental level. But here's where the philosophical questions begin to press in on us. If this scream occurred, if it was audible outside the house to a neighbor some distance away, then what does it mean that apparently no one inside the home reported hearing it? We're not talking about a household where everyone was asleep in distant wings of a mansion. We're talking about a family home, relatively contained, where sound travels. The acoustics of residential architecture are fairly predictable, especially the acoustics of distress. High-frequency sounds, the kind produced by a child's scream, penetrate walls and doors more effectively than low-frequency sounds. They're harder to muffle, harder to contain. From a psychological standpoint, we have to consider what it means when a sound that reached a neighbor didn't apparently register with the people who were presumably closest to its source. Was it genuinely not heard? Or was it heard and, for reasons we need to understand, not acknowledged? The distinction between those two possibilities is everything. It's the difference between tragedy and something far more calculated. Let's shift to the forensic criminology angle for a moment. In cases where a child has been lost, investigators routinely examine the timeline with extreme precision. Every sound, every action, every reported event gets placed on a continuum and examined for consistency. A scream, particularly one described as animalistic, represents a critical marker in that timeline. It suggests a moment of acute distress, a point at which something terrible was either happening or had just happened. From a logical standpoint, if we accept that this scream occurred around the time that the situation in that home reached its crisis point, then we're forced to ask, what would produce such a sound? Pain certainly could, but there's a difference between the cry that comes from sudden injury and the scream that comes from terror. They have different qualities, different vocal signatures. A scream of pure fear, the kind that comes when a child realizes something terrible is happening and cannot be stopped. That scream has a particular desperation to it. It's not just loud, it's loaded with emotional content that any listener can recognize at an instinctive level. From a psychological perspective, we need to consider what happens in the mind of someone who hears that scream. The human brain is extraordinarily good at pattern recognition, particularly when it comes to distress signals from children. Mothers, fathers, caregivers, they can distinguish their own child's cry from dozens of others in a crowded space. They can tell the difference between a cry that means I'm frustrated and one that means I'm hurt, and one that means I'm genuinely frightened. This isn't learned behavior in the traditional sense. It's something deeper, something that activates ancient neural pathways that predate language itself. So when we think about the people in that house that night, we have to ask, if this scream occurred, how could it possibly have been missed? The physiological response to hearing a child in distress is nearly automatic. The pulse quickens, attention narrows and focuses. The body prepares to act, unless something is interfering with that normal response. Unless there's a reason that the sound, even if heard, couldn't be acknowledged or acted upon in the way we would expect. And this brings us to a deeply uncomfortable question, one that sits at the intersection of criminal psychology and human nature. What would it take for someone to hear a child scream, a sound that evolution has designed to be irresistible, to demand immediate response, and not react? We're not talking about sleeping through it, although that's the explanation that might be offered. We're talking about the possibility of conscious awareness without acknowledgement. The criminal mindset, when it comes to situations like this, often involves a kind of compartmentalization. There's a shutting down of normal empathetic response, a walling off of emotional reaction that allows someone to proceed with actions that would otherwise be psychologically unbearable. It's not that they don't hear the scream, it's that they've created an internal framework where the scream doesn't mean what it would mean to anyone else. It becomes, in their mind, a necessary part of a sequence they've convinced themselves has to unfold. This is the rationalization that allows someone to continue when every fiber of their being should be telling them to stop. From a philosophical standpoint, we're confronting one of the darkest aspects of human consciousness, the capacity to override our most basic instincts. The protective impulse toward children is nearly universal, hardwired into our species at a level that makes it one of our defining characteristics. And yet, history and forensic records tell us that this instinct can be suppressed, can be pushed down beneath layers of rationalization, fear, panic, or desperation. When we think about that scream cutting through the night air, we're thinking about a moment where someone had a choice. The scream is a call to action, an alarm that demands intervention. The response to that scream, or the lack of response, tells us something profound about what was happening in the minds and hearts of the people who were there. It tells us about priorities in that moment, about what was considered more important than investigating a child's cry. And that ordering of priorities, that hierarchy of concerns, reveals more than almost anything else could about the true nature of what transpired. So when we circle back to that neighbor's testimony, when we sit with the specificity of their description, animalistic, not just loud but fundamentally disturbing, we're looking at a piece of evidence that refuses to sit quietly in the narrative that was constructed afterward. From a logical perspective, the scream creates problems for certain explanations. From a psychological perspective, it raises questions about awareness and response that don't have comfortable answers. From a physiological standpoint, it tells us something about the extremity of what was happening, about the level of distress that would produce such a sound. And from the perspective of forensic criminology, it's a marker, a fixed point in time that helps us understand sequence and causation. The scream happened. Someone heard it clearly enough to describe it years later, and yet, within the house, there was reportedly nothing unusual, nothing that warranted concern or investigation. That disconnect between the external perception and the internal account is where we find one of the most significant fault lines in this entire case. It's a rupture in the story that no amount of explanation has ever quite managed to seal. Theme 2, the silence that follows sound. Let's think about what comes after a scream like that. There's a silence that follows extreme vocalization, a stillness that settles in the wake of that kind of expenditure of energy and emotion. From a physiological perspective, the body, after producing such a sound, is depleted. The diaphragm has contracted forcefully. The lungs have expelled air at high velocity. The vocal cords have vibrated at their limit. There's often a moment of near silence afterward, a brief pause where the respiratory system resets and oxygen debt begins to be repaid. But beyond the purely physical, there's a psychological dimension to this silence that we need to examine. When someone screams with that kind of intensity and no help arrives, no response comes, there's a shift that happens in their understanding of their situation. Hope begins to die. The realization sets in that the sound, no matter how loud or desperate, hasn't changed anything. And in cases where a child is involved, that realization is particularly devastating because children, more than adults, have faith in the power of calling for help. They believe that if they cry loudly enough, someone will come. When that doesn't happen, something breaks in their fundamental trust of the world. From an anthropological perspective, the silence after a child's scream should be one of the shortest intervals imaginable. Across cultures, across human history, the response time to a child's distress call averages just seconds. It's an instinct that overrides almost everything else. People will abandon what they're doing, will rush toward the sound without conscious thought, will put themselves in potential danger to reach a child who sounds like they're in trouble. This is how our species has survived. Children are vulnerable for a prolonged period compared to most mammals, and their survival has depended on adults being hyper-responsive to their distress signals. So when we think about a scream being heard by a neighbor, but apparently not generating an immediate response from within the household, we're looking at a deviation from one of the most fundamental patterns of human behavior. That deviation demands explanation. It requires us to ask what circumstances, what state of mind, what overriding concerns could possibly suppress that basic protective impulse. Now let's consider the criminal mindset in the aftermath of such a sound. If someone in that house was responsible for the circumstances that led to that scream, the silence that followed would have been loaded with a very different kind of tension. There's a moment of waiting, of listening to hear if others have been alerted, if the scream has drawn attention that will complicate what comes next. From a logical standpoint, the person responsible would be acutely aware that sound travels, that neighbors might have heard, that time is now a factor in a way it wasn't before. This creates pressure, forces decisions to be made more quickly than they might have been otherwise. The scream becomes a complication in whatever plan or sequence of actions is underway. It's evidence of things not going according to script, of control slipping, of a situation evolving in ways that weren't intended or anticipated. And that loss of control often leads to escalation, to desperate measures to regain some sense of managing the circumstances. From a psychological angle, we need to think about what hearing that scream would do to someone who wasn't responsible, but who was in the house. If we're considering the possibility that not everyone in that household was involved in what happened, then the scream becomes a potential point of divergence, a moment where someone could have intervened, could have checked, could have changed the trajectory of events. The fact that apparently no such intervention occurred raises difficult questions about awareness, about intentional ignorance, about the psychological mechanisms people use to avoid knowing things they don't want to know. There's a kind of willful deafness that can occur when confronting a truth would be too devastating, would require actions too difficult to contemplate. People can train themselves not to hear what they can't afford to hear, not to see what they can't bear to see. It's a form of psychological self-preservation, but it comes at a terrible cost. Let's shift to thinking about the forensic implications of that silence. When investigators piece together timelines, they're looking for sounds, for events that can be verified and placed in sequence. A scream reported by a neighbor is a gift to investigators in some ways. It's a timestamp, a marker that something significant was happening at a specific time. But that gift becomes complicated when the accounts from inside the house don't acknowledge that scream, don't incorporate it into their narrative of the night's events. That creates what forensic analysts call a conflict in the timeline, a point where external and internal accounts diverge. And here's the thing about such conflicts. They don't usually occur randomly. When there's a systematic difference between what outsiders observed and what insiders report, it often indicates that the insider account has been shaped by motivations other than simply recounting what happened. Memory can be fallible, certainly, but there's a pattern to how memory fails. And that pattern doesn't typically involve everyone in a household uniformly failing to remember a child's scream. From a philosophical perspective, we're dealing with questions about truth and perception, about the nature of reality when accounts conflict. What does it mean when a sound exists in one person's experience but is absent from another's, especially when both were presumably within range to hear it? We're forced to consider the subjective nature of experience, yes, but we're also forced to consider motivated perception, the ways in which people's accounts of events are shaped by what they need to be true, by what they can psychologically afford to acknowledge. This isn't always a conscious process. The human mind is remarkably skilled at protecting itself from unbearable truths, at reconstructing memory in ways that allow someone to live with themselves. But from a criminological standpoint, those reconstructions leave traces. They create inconsistencies, gaps, details that don't quite fit. And it's in those spaces between the official account and the physical evidence, between what was said and what was heard, that we often find the truth of what actually occurred. When we think about the silence following that scream, we also need to consider what wasn't done in that silence. There was no apparent search, no calling out to check on the child, no movement through the house that we can verify. The next verified activity comes much later in the timeline. So we're looking at a gap, a period of time where, according to the accounts given, nothing of note occurred. But screams don't happen in a vacuum. They're responses to circumstances, and those circumstances don't simply resolve themselves into silence without action. From a logical perspective, if we hear a child scream like that, there are really only a limited number of scenarios that lead to subsequent silence. Either the child is comforted and the distress is resolved, or the child is physically unable to continue making noise, or the child has been removed from the situation that caused the distress. Each of these possibilities has different implications, different requirements in terms of action and intervention. The accounts from that night don't clearly describe any of these interventions, and that absence is itself telling. So we're left with this haunting image, a sound piercing the winter night, loud enough to reach a neighbor, desperate enough to be characterized as animalistic, and then nothing. Silence settling back over the house like snow. No flurry of activity, no parents rushing to check, no lights coming on, no doors opening, just that terrible stillness from every angle we examine it. Logical, psychological, physiological, forensic, anthropological, philosophical, and criminological. That silence asks questions that have never been satisfactorily answered. It represents a gap in the narrative that should have been filled with action, with response, with the ordinary human reactions to a child in distress. Instead, we have a void, and sometimes, in cases like this, it's the voids that tell us more than all the words that were carefully constructed to fill them. The silence after the scream is as significant as the scream itself, perhaps more so because it speaks to choices made in a moment when the clock was ticking and decisions couldn't be unmade. Theme 3, the weight of what we choose not to hear. There's a deeper layer to this that we need to explore, one that touches on the most uncomfortable aspects of human psychology. We've talked about the possibility of not hearing the scream, of genuinely being unaware. We've talked about hearing it and responding, but there's a third possibility that sits between those two, and it's perhaps the most troubling. The possibility of hearing something and choosing, at some level, not to process it, not to act on it, not to let it register in a way that would demand response. This isn't the same as simply ignoring a sound. It's more complex, more deeply rooted in the psychological mechanisms we use to protect ourselves from unbearable knowledge. From a psychological standpoint, we're talking about dissociation, compartmentalization, the mind's ability to cordon off information that threatens to overwhelm its capacity to function. When someone is in a state of extreme stress, fear, or denial, they can develop what psychologists call a narrowed field of awareness, a tunnel vision where only certain inputs are processed, while others, no matter how significant, are filtered out. Think about how this might manifest in a household where something terrible is unfolding. From a physiological perspective, the people involved might be in states of profound stress that alter their normal perceptual and cognitive functioning. Chronic stress floods the system with cortisol, which over time impairs memory formation and reduces the brain's ability to integrate new information effectively. Acute stress activates the amygdala and can temporarily impair the functioning of the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for executive function, decision-making, and rational thought. In such a state, people can act on autopilot, can go through motions while their conscious awareness is actually fragmented or compromised. They might genuinely, in some sense, not remember hearing certain things because those memories were never properly encoded in the first place. The brain, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what's happening, simply fails to create lasting records of certain events. This is well documented in trauma psychology, and it has profound implications for how we interpret witness statements and recollections. But we also have to consider the possibility that's harder to accept, the one that speaks to moral dimensions rather than purely psychological ones. What if the scream was heard, was processed at some level, but was met with a decision, conscious or semi-conscious, to do nothing? From a philosophical perspective, we're in territory that challenges our understanding of human nature. We want to believe that certain responses are automatic, that the sight or sound of a child in distress triggers reactions that bypass individual choice. But the truth, as uncomfortable as it is that people can override these instincts. They can, in certain states of mind, under certain pressures, make calculations that prioritize other concerns over a child's immediate welfare. This doesn't necessarily make them monsters in the traditional sense. It makes them humans in crisis, capable of the kind of devastating moral failures that occur when fear, self-preservation, or denial become powerful enough to silence conscience. From a criminological perspective, this is where we start to understand the concept of complicity through inaction. In many legal systems, there's recognition that failure to act when one has a duty to act can constitute criminal behavior. A parent has a duty to protect their child, to respond when that child is in distress. If that duty is abandoned, if the response that should be automatic fails to occur, then we're looking at a form of participation in whatever harm follows. The criminal mindset in such cases often involves a kind of paralysis born of recognition that intervening would mean confronting truths too terrible to face. There's a moment of choice, a fork in the road where one path leads to action and the other to complicity. And sometimes the second path is chosen not out of active malice, but out of a desperate desire to remain in a state of not knowing, to preserve some fragment of normalcy even as everything falls apart around them. Let's think about the anthropological context for a moment. Across cultures, there are taboos against harming children that are nearly universal and extraordinarily powerful. But there are also, in every culture, mechanisms for dealing with situations where those taboos have been violated. Silence is often one of those mechanisms. When something unspeakable has occurred, when the family unit has been fractured by a violation of its most fundamental bonds, the response is often to close ranks, to create a shared narrative that everyone can live with, to collectively agree not to examine too closely what really happened. This isn't unique to any one culture or community. It's a human pattern, a way of managing unbearable knowledge. The pressure to maintain family cohesion, to protect the family's public image, to avoid the devastating consequences of full acknowledgement. These pressures can be powerful enough to reshape memory itself, to convince people over time that the sanitized version they've told themselves is actually what occurred. From a logical standpoint, we can trace the progression. A scream occurs, it's heard by someone outside the house, but inside the house, it either isn't heard or isn't acknowledged. If it wasn't heard, we have to explain how sound traveled through walls and windows to reach a neighbor, but not to the people presumably closer to its source. That strains credulity. If it was heard but not acknowledged, we have to understand what would make such non-acknowledgement possible. And this is where the intersection of psychology and criminology becomes crucial. Non-acknowledgement requires motivation. It requires that acting on the scream, investigating its source, confronting what caused it, that all of these responses carry costs that, in that moment, seem higher than the cost of doing nothing. What could make the cost of investigation seem too high? What would someone be protecting by choosing not to know? The answers to those questions take us into dark territory, into considerations of what people are willing to sacrifice to avoid certain revelations. From a psychological perspective, we're looking at the phenomenon of motivated reasoning, where people's assessment of evidence and their interpretation of events are shaped by what they need or want to be true. If acknowledging the scream means acknowledging what the scream implied, and if what it implied was too shattering to integrate into one's understanding of reality, then the scream can be psychologically minimized, reframed, or erased from the narrative. This isn't necessarily a conscious or deliberate process. The mind's protective mechanisms can operate below the level of conscious awareness, shaping memory and perception in ways the person themselves might not recognize. Over time, what was initially a choice not to examine too closely becomes, in memory, a simple absence of knowledge. I didn't hear anything becomes true in the person's recollection because they've successfully convinced themselves it's true. And so we come full circle, back to that sound, cutting through the winter darkness. The scream was real. We have a witness to its existence. What happened to that scream after it was produced? How it was received and processed by those who should have heard it? What actions were taken or not taken in response? These questions sit at the heart of understanding what occurred in that house. From every analytical angle, logical, psychological, physiological, forensic, anthropological, philosophical, and criminological, the scream and the response to it reveal patterns of behavior that don't align with innocence, don't align with normal parental concern, don't align with the narratives that were later constructed. Instead, they align with something far more troubling: a household in which a child's most desperate cry for help was met with silence, with inaction, with a failure so profound that its echoes still resound through every attempt to understand what happened that night. The animalistic scream wasn't just a sound, it was a moment of truth, a rupture in whatever facade was being maintained, a brief window into something that someone desperately needed to keep hidden. And the silence that followed? That was the sound of doors closing, of decisions being made, of a tragedy being allowed to complete its terrible arc, while those who could have changed its course chose, for reasons we're still trying to fully understand, to do nothing at all. We've examined this single element, a scream heard by a neighbor, described as animalistic, piercing the night, from multiple perspectives, and each perspective has added layers to our understanding. What emerges isn't a simple answer, but a pattern, a constellation of details that refuse to align with the explanations we've been given. The scream happened. The silence followed. And in that sequence, in that gap between sound and response, we find one of the most significant pieces of evidence in this entire case. Not because it tells us exactly what occurred, but because it reveals the fault lines in the story, the places where the official narrative cannot bear the weight of scrutiny. Next time, we'll continue pulling at these threads, following them wherever they lead, committed to understanding not just what happened, but why the truth has remained so elusive for so long.